All right, before we get started, did everybody get a handout for tonight to follow along, an outline? If you didn't, we got some. Bo, would you grab some for me? And Bo's coming through to give you those. If you'll just slip a hand up if you didn't get one, and we'll get you one. All right, fantastic. Well, as always, we're so glad you're here. If you've got your copy of Scripture, we're going to be in the book of Judges tonight. We're actually going to just kind of be introducing the book to you and kind of talking about it before we kind of dive in, because I feel like it's always good to kind of understand where things are coming from, what's happening, what's going on before we just jump in, and especially a book like Judges. How many of you have actually read the book of Judges? A few of us, okay. Book of Judges, you're going to find out, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, is a pretty scary book. It's got a lot of mess in there. It's the book that I recommend to people when they tell me that people are basically good. They're basically good and they do good things. I was like, go read the book of Judges, and you'll figure out that that's not the case. But the book of Judges is really amazing, and as we work through this tonight, I want you to give you some facts about understanding the book, the context, what's happening in the world, kind of when this was written, why it was written, what's going on. We'll talk about, what is a judge and why the people had judges, why God instituted judges. And then we'll end with what are some ethical questions that we're going to have to face when we read this book and deal with what's going on in there, because there's some ethical stuff that we need to talk about. So as we jump in, the first thing we want to look at is understanding the book of Judges. And Judges was most likely written by Samuel. Basically what we can see is that Samuel, he was the prophet for Saul and for David, and he was one of the major prophets in the Old Testament. And so what we see from just internal evidence in the book and different things like that this was written by Samuel, and it was written after the coronation of Saul, when Saul becomes king, but before David becomes king. Now, you'll see a lot in the book of Judges. It says, in those days. In those days, this happened. In those days, this happened. When you read that, what that means is the person wasn't writing it in that day. He's writing it at a later time and saying, in those days, that's what happened. In fact, there are a few phrases in there. He'll say, and these people were here up until this day. And so you're thinking, well, wait a second. If you're writing first person right now, why would you say that? Well, because he's writing it later. He's looking back and writing on these things. Now, a cool fact that I didn't know about is that the Judges really is a companion book with Ruth, that these two books go together. And basically what we look at is that this is two different pictures of what it looks like to follow God. They're actually kind of bookends. You get Judges and you get Ruth. And so Judges, you get the entire history of the judge period, the period of the judges. And then in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the time of the judges. That's when the book of Ruth is set. And what you really get is this kind of really stark contrast between Judges and Ruth. And we'll dig into that more in just a minute. But basically, Judges is what it looks like when the wheels come off in the life of people and in a nation. If you've ever wondered, what would it look like to watch a nation implode? Well, the book of Judges is going to help you see that. This is what happens when the wheels completely come off and everything just kind of blows up. And then Ruth, what happens? Ruth comes in the middle of this, and you see God at work in the life of an individual, and then in a people, and God bringing healing and forgiveness and restoration. And so these two beautiful bookends, you get to the end of Judges, and I'll be honest, when we get to the end of Judges, you're not going to have a warm, fuzzy feeling in your heart. Actually, some of the worst things in the book happen at the end of the book of Judges. You're going to get to the end of it and want to say, I think I want to throw up. This is not what I want to hear. This is not what I want to talk about. But remember, Ruth is coming, and what we get in Ruth is all of these pictures of Jesus. You have this kinsman redeemer, this one who is of the same people as you, coming into your rescue and buying you back and bringing you home and taking care of the debt. This wonderful, beautiful pictures that we're going to get there. And so it's amazing when we have both of these things together. You get this full picture of God's work in the life of people. One, he has to bring judgment and discipline to his people who don't listen. And then 2, he gets to bring forgiveness and reconciliation and redemption. So it's really 2 stories. And then this also was surprising to me that Bethlehem is a main character in both books. The city of Bethlehem is a main character in the book of Judges and also in the book of Ruth. Now, for most of us, our familiarity with Bethlehem starts where? Jesus, right? We know, oh, little town of Bethlehem. We sing it every Christmas. And so we think, that Bethlehem didn't exist until Jesus was born there. And all of a sudden, oh, that's Jesus' hometown. Well, true, but Bethlehem has actually been around for a long, long time. And Bethlehem was not the city that we find in Jesus' time. Bethlehem in the book of Judges rivals Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's really hard to wrap your head around that, but when you read the book of Judges and you start to hear all the terrible things that are happening, you're going to think, Bethlehem? Jesus' hometown? Really? Yeah, really. But again, just like Judges and Ruth are 2 different pictures of what it looks like to follow God, Bethlehem is a picture of what happens in a city when God moves and works in it. So here we have in the book of Judges that Bethlehem is a rival to Sodom and Gomorrah with just the evil and the horrendous things that are happening. But we get to the book of Ruth, and Bethlehem becomes the centerpiece, the place where God shows off his kindness and compassion and love and grace. Now, so any questions about that before we move forward? Any comments or discussion we need to have? Good? Okay. Now, this book of Judges, not counting Ruth, but the book of Judges covers about a 350-year period from the death of Joshua to Samuel, to when Samuel writes this. And so you got to think about this. I mean, a lot of things are happening in the life of the people. Joshua dies. They're already into the promised land. Joshua dies, and now we have 350 years. Now, I will tell you that we don't know for sure if it's 350 years. Some people say it's 257. Some people say it's 407. And we'll talk about this in a minute. The reason it's tough is because when they're giving the reigns of the judges and how long they reign, some judges reign consecutively, which means one reign, they stop, and another. Some reign concurrently. So you have judge and judge and judge, and they're all reigning at the same time, but they overlap and all those kind of things. And so it's kind of hard to say actually how long this is. But we think it's 350 years. And like I said, dating the book is difficult because of how the judges ruled. And one of the things that's really interesting here is there's a huge difference from Joshua to the judges. There's a huge difference in leadership and mission and purpose and all these things. When we see this, what happens with Joshua is all throughout the book of Joshua, you see moral integrity. Joshua does what's right. Joshua stands for God. Joshua speaks for God. So you see all that. Then Joshua dies and all that moral integrity goes away. What we get is questionable ethics. The people could trust Joshua. They knew what he was going to do. They knew how he was going to act. And what happened, Joshua dies and we enter in this reign, the period of the judges, and these judges just start doing whatever they want. And the people start doing whatever they want. And so what at one point was unthinkable now is like, well, it's okay. Everybody's doing it, So we go from moral integrity to questionable integrity. Israel was a unified nation under Joshua. They had a mission, they had a purpose, they had a goal. We have to get in the promised land. We have to go where God's calling us to. Joshua dies and the nation splits apart. What you have is you have this wonderful leader given by God who gives direction and spiritual authority and all these kind of things, and the people are able to rally around him and rally behind him, and then he dies. And there's no person to step up. Moses died, and everybody knew who was going to lead after Moses died. It was Joshua. Because Joshua had been with Moses and been trained by Moses, but Joshua dies, and there's nobody. And so what happens is you have this unification. They're just rallied around one thing, and then they get into the promised land, and they just splinter apart. The phrase that you hear throughout the book of Judges is, the people did what was right in their own eyes. That's a common phrase. And so what happens is the nation goes from being unified to being split apart, because you can't have a unified nation when everyone's trying to do what they want to do and what's right in their own eyes. Because what's right in my eyes might not be right. It's right in your eyes, and what's right in your eyes might not be right in what's my eyes. And so it just creates all kinds of division. And one of the big differences that we see is, as I was developing a lot of this content from commentaries in different places, I love that they said this, that when Joshua was around, the people were mostly obedient. And I think that's pretty true. You look at the Old Testament, especially with Moses. I mean, how many times did Moses tell the people, like, I'm so sick of you. Like, why can't you get your, and that's my paraphrase. That's not exactly how he said it. He said it in other ways, but basically what Moses was saying is, I'm tired of you. Why don't you stop complaining? Why don't you listen and pay attention? But mostly, they were obedient. They go from mostly obedient to Joshua dying and everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. Definitely not what's right in God's eyes. And this is big. This is one of the things, and if you're kind of listening to this, you start to think, man, that sounds a lot like where we're living today. One of the commentaries said that, and I really like this, one of the commentaries said that Judges and Ruth are very modern books. And we wouldn't think that they are, right? I mean, that's some Old Testament stuff. Why would I want to read Judges? I mean, it has nothing to do with us now. Does it sound like it has some stuff to do with us? That we're not unified and people are doing what's right in their own eyes. And one of the things it talks about with Joshua, they had an objective morality. There was a standard outside of themselves that determined what was right and wrong. And that standard was God. God determined. God was the foundation of how they came to understand what right is, what wrong is. And when Joshua dies and they enter into this period of the Judges, and they go from objective morality to subjective. Objective means that I'm not the one that determines what is right and wrong, that there's a standard that I have to live up to. Subjective means I determine what's right and wrong. And now this is where we live in our culture right now. You may have heard it said this way, well, that's just your truth. That's just the way that you live. That's right for you. It's not right for me. And here's the problem. There is no such thing as your truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There is only such thing as the truth. And so we go from this objective morality, this objective standard that there is a God, he has spoken to us and he's told us what he wants from us and for us, to do whatever you want. And I can't say anything to you and you can't say anything to me because it's my truth. It's your truth. That's just the way that you choose to live. And finally, one of the biggest differences is they went from clear conviction. They understood that there was something called sin. God had defined it. God had spoken about it. God had given them blessings and cursings and all these kind of things to say, this is clearly what sin is. This is what I desire and what I don't. They went from clear conviction to compromise. Not only did they do what was right in their own sight, but they completely ignored what God told them to do. I mean, very quickly, you're going to find out, like, they moved into their new homes, they settled in the promised land, and 37 and a half seconds later, they were participating in everything that the culture was doing around them. Oh, our neighbors are having sex under a tree? Let's go join them. Let's do that. Oh, our neighbors are sacrificing children? Let's go do that. I mean, it was crazy. They move into the promised land. This is, God's grace to them. This was God's promise to them. That's why it's called the promised land. They get there, the promise is fulfilled, and they just throw the whole thing out the window and immediately go and start doing exactly what everybody else around them is doing. So they go from clear conviction to compromise. Now, what happens here is, as we start looking at this, and we're going to kind of pull these things apart and unpack them and work through them as we go through the scriptures and things. But most definitely, this is not the good old days. It's funny how we can just kind of wash out all the junk in our life, and we look back on times in our life and they could be really horrible and terrible, but we still call them the good old days, right? This would not be one of those times that anybody would be excited to go back and remember. Kind of like us. We don't want to go back and remember the times of slavery. That's not the good old days. Or if you're in Germany, the Holocaust and all that, that's not the good old days. This is exactly what's happening in Judges. That this is a time of really, really, really horrible decisions and a downward spiral. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But here's the thing I want to prepare you for. If this book were made into a movie, it would be rated NC-17. Actually, it would probably be rated XXX. Just to be upfront with you, and you may not know that this is in the Bible, but these are just a few things that we're going to have to talk about. Idolatry, and you think, oh, that's easy, no big deal. Idolatry, gang rape, murder, sexual perversion, kidnapping, incest, all sorts of different things. And you think, that's in the Bible? Yeah, it is. And what you're going to see is that all of these things are to help us see where humanity goes when they're not connected to God. The natural progression of where we go and what we do without God. And the hard part of this is that everyone seems infected with sin. You know, we talked about Bethlehem kind of being two different cities, and we have Judges and Ruth being two different books. One of the things that happens when you read this book and you see individuals, a culture, and a nation kind of breaking apart at the seams and pulling away from objective morality and to subjective morality and to doing what they want to do and disobeying God's commands, what you see is the very thing that they want, freedom, isn't what they get. But what happens is it makes everything unsafe. What you're going to find as you read through this book is as you kind of start connecting to people and you're connecting to these situations, you're going to feel that there's no woman that's safe in this culture. And that's true. That there's no place that you can go that is going to give you hospitality. I mean, one of the things we find out in this book is they stop in a city and they're going to stay overnight, and a guy comes to him and says, you don't need to stay here. You don't need to do that. It's the worst place. Get out of town. You need to leave. No place is safe. And what happens is what you begin to see is it just erodes everything that connects us and holds us together and gives us purpose and meaning. It just tears all that apart. And here's another thing, and I think this is intentional. Samuel, through the telling of this story, much like John, and we just finished the Gospel of John, much like John, John pointed to things and said, here are signs that Jesus is the Messiah. Samuel basically takes the 10 Commandments, applies them to the book of Judges, and shows that every one of the 10 Commandments are broken and multiple times broken. And then like with just kind of audaciousness that they're broken. It's just the audacity of these people just to flaunt the 10 Commandments that they had just affirmed. We get to the end of Joshua, and there's that wonderful saying that we all love to crochet on pillows and have, hung up in posters in our house. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. Well, the context of that is Joshua tells that to the people. He knows he's going to die, and he basically puts before them, you've got a choice to make. The choice I'm making is that I and my household are going to serve God. And they all affirm the same thing. Yeah, we're going to do that. And a minute after Joshua died, they threw that cross stitch out, and I was like, nope, time to serve myself. Let's go do that. But what happens is we get this thing where it just kind of pulls everything apart, and every single commandment is broken. But also we see when God puts it all back together in Ruth, we see that God doesn't leave them alone, that God doesn't let them go, that God, even in his judgments, and we'll see that through the book of Judges, we'll talk about that more in a second, all of it is to draw people back in, to bring them to him so that he can redeem them and forgive them. Well, they struggle to obey the commandments of God, and it's really, I hate to even use that word struggle, because struggle would mean that they tried. And I want to give them some credit. I think they did try from time to time, but this wasn't so much a struggle to obey God's commands. It was a struggle not to. They did everything they could not to obey. And in fact, they outright ignored God's commands. And here's the funny thing, and you'll see this in the book of Judges, and God kind of sets this up for us to see it. We have this idea, and I think the people of Israel at the time had this idea that sin doesn't have any consequences. And we all know people like that. There was a time when we thought that way. Sometimes we still do. You know, I can do this, I can say this, I can live this way, and it's not going to hurt anybody but me, and I'm okay with that. What we see in the book of Judges as we go forward is that sin has consequences, sometimes generationally, things that get passed down. Now, I don't believe in generational curses. That's not what we're talking about here. Jesus broke all generational curses, but because there's no such thing as passing that down. But what we're talking about is when we break laws and we change laws and we deal with the way that what God's supposed to be doing in our life, and we change that fundamentally, that has consequences. In fact, what you're going to find out is the people of Israel don't follow one of God's commands to get rid of a certain group of people, to push them out and get rid of them. Well, they don't do that, and we get to the book of Esther many generations later, and one of the people who we didn't get rid of, his name is Haman, and he tries to destroy all the Jews. And what happens that you see is that because they continued in sin and rebellion and throwing off God's commands, they pay for these consequences for a long, long time. And it's something that we need to wake up to and really see that sin has consequences, and sometimes consequences that last a lot longer than we think they would. So, one of the reasons that they struggled to obey God's commands is they were happy to be settled and safe. Now you got to think, for 40 years they were in the wilderness, and then they come into the conquest where they're going into the promised land and they're fighting all these people and they're kind of dealing with all this stuff and they're trying to find their place, and now they're here. They're settled. And they got settled really quickly. They got settled by not pushing out the people that God said get rid of them because of the things that they've done. They got settled really quickly because they started intermarrying these people, and they started adopting their culture and started adopting their worship. And so they got settled. And then they felt safe. And it's funny because God didn't want them to be safe. God wanted them to stand out. God wanted the nations around them to see them live different. And they chose safety over calling. And so here's what they did. Here's the best way for us to be safe. We'll just be like everybody else. We'll just do what everybody else does. We'll just believe what everybody else believes. And we say we love God and we follow God. We'll just tack on all this other stuff too, because we don't want to be weird. We don't want to stand out. We want to be safe. We want to be settled. And so one of the things that we need to look at as we walk through this is how quickly these people integrated into their culture when God didn't want them to integrate into the culture. He wanted them to go in and transform culture. And for us, we have to ask the question, am I settled? Am I settled in the culture that I'm in? Am I like everybody else around me? Am I safe? I don't stand out. I don't really talk about who God is. I don't really share about what God's done. I sound like everybody else. I think like everybody else. I talk like everybody else. It's a big question. And fundamentally, this was their undoing. The reason they had so much problem is because they wanted to be settled and they wanted to be safe. Now, those things aren't bad. We need to have those things in our life, but at what cost? At what cost to ourselves and our walk with God and our relationship with this world do we settle into our culture and find safety in it? God wants us to settle ourselves in Him and find our safety in Him. So when we get all of this kind of put together and we realize that this isn't the good old days, what we find is that this is a chronicle of a 350-year downward spiral for individuals and for a nation. Now, We hear all the quotes where it talks about that we need to know history. If we don't know history, we're doomed to repeat it. But here's the thing. They weren't repeating it. What happens is every time they made the circle, they just went further and further down. It just got worse and worse and worse. So yeah, maybe they repeated some of the mistakes, but it was like, hey, I'm going to take that mistake and I'm going to up it. I'm going to let you see how bad I can really be. And then they come for the next revolution. Well, yeah, I'm going to take both of those things and let me add on this. If you thought that was bad, wait till you see this. And so we just keep seeing them go down and go down and go down and go down. It's an endless cycle. They repeat this over and over again. In fact, we see it throughout the entire New Testament or Old Testament. They repeat this cycle over and over again. And so here's the cycle. They sin. They fall away from God. They rebel against God, and they just go open into their sin and live how they want to live and do what they want to do. And then God, in his anger, says, I'm not going to allow this. This is not what I created you for. This is not what I've called you for. And so I'm going to bring discipline in your life to call you back. Now, we read this and we think God's being super harsh, but what God would do is he would bring foreign nations against the people of Israel who would enslave them, who would, oppress them, who would kill them, who would do all these kind of things, till finally the people would say, enough. This is too much. And they would repent. And they would return and they would call out to God, God, help us. And God would send a judge, a deliverer. And that deliverer would come and help free them from the enslavement that they were in, and we would start the cycle all over again. So we'd have a few years of peace and prosperity and people living for God and the nation living for God, and then the slide and the sin and the rebellion, and here we are again. God's bringing judgment. Now, I'll say this several times as we go through this study like I did with the disciples in John. It's really easy for us to sit here and Wednesday night quarterback those people and say, well, after the first time, I think I would have gotten it right and I wouldn't have had a problem anymore. Well, we could sit down and have a conversation about your life and my life. And if we're honest, I think this cycle shows up in our life, doesn't it? We sin, we rebel, we fall, consequences come, and then we cry out to God, and God delivers us and brings us back, and we return, and then things are kind of going well, and then what happens? Things go too well, then we get the big head. We don't need God. We don't have to listen to God. I can do it on my own. And where do we end up again? Right back where we started. So don't do that. Don't Wednesday night quarterback and say, oh, I would never be there. I'm totally cool with, I'd be awesome. Your life, my life, doesn't bear that out. But here's the thing, and this is something we need to see. As they continue down in the spiral, and especially as we get toward the end of the book, the judges got worse. Every time the spiral came around, the judge got worse, and got worse, and got worse, and got worse. Because the judges began to reflect the people. Instead of the judge being the example and calling people back to God and saying, watch the way that I live, listen to how I teach, follow my example, the judges began to reflect the people. And that's a scary deal. I mean, it's not too hard for us to look at our system right now, and it seems like that we have politicians and preachers and people that are supposed to be our leaders reflecting the people more than they are reflecting God. So the question is, how does this happen? How do you go into a 350-year slide? And it just gets worse and worse and worse. What can we learn from this? Because really, that's what we want to know. What can we learn from this? God didn't put this in the Bible for us to sit and laugh at these people and say, man, I hate that it was you, glad it's not me. No, God gives us these things. He tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 that he gives us these things as an example for us, that we can learn and not end up the way that they did. So what can we learn from this? Well, one of the things I think we can learn is watching this slide and seeing how it kind of happens in a subtle way. And so what happens is in this slide, where it starts, is that unthinkable thoughts get presented. They go into the land and they start hearing from their neighbors the things that their neighbors are doing, and it's no big deal. This is how we worship our God. We go have sex over here, and we go, sacrifice kids, and we go do this. And the people go, oh my goodness. And at first they're kind of like, that's kind of scary. But they hear the unthinkable thoughts and they go, well, wait a second. We probably need to hear them out on this. I mean, they've been here a really long time. And it seems like that they're sincere in their worship. I mean, it'd be bad of us not to hear them out, right? So we start there. Instead of saying, no, this is what God has said, this is what God has told us, we start to hear those things out and go, well, okay. And then the leaders begin to listen to these unthinkable thoughts and begin to present their position and say, well, listen, I'm not saying that we condone this. And I'm not saying that we participate in it, but listen, we can't be so rigid. I mean, we can't go to these people and say that what they believe is wrong. God forbid that we tell someone that they're wrong. So let's not be so rigid. It's okay for us as Jews, or it's okay for us as Christians to live the way that we live, but we should never be rigid about those beliefs and dare tell anybody and dare question what they believe. Well, that goes some time, and then the leaders not only listen, but the leaders accept. And leaders say, well, listen, this isn't for us. This isn't what we need to do to flourish, but who are we to tell them what they can do? They're free. They're free to do whatever they want. And we should just let them be free to do whatever they want. Who are we to judge? And then time goes on, and the leaders go from listening to accepting to adopting. And the leaders come back, and here's what they say. Well, we've come to realize that not only can they do what they want, but we can do what we want, and so we need to do whatever we want to do. And some might say, well, hasn't God said? Well, yeah, he has, but who cares? It doesn't apply to you. Yeah, God said it, but if you don't believe it or if it doesn't fit with your lifestyle, go do what you want to do. And that's going to be what we heard. That's kind of the motto of the people of the book of Judges. They did what was right in their own eyes. So as we look at this, we need to see in our life and in our world how subtle that is. And you hear it all the time. I mean, how many times do you hear, well, maybe we just need to hear this out? I mean, I totally don't disagree with this, but I think I just need to hear it out. I think I just need to listen a little bit more. I think I just don't need to have an opinion on this just yet. And then we come along and say, well, listen, we can't be rigid here. I mean, they're sincere and they really believe what they believe. And so it's really wrong for you to be rigid and say there's only one way and there's only one truth. That's super rigid and we shouldn't do that. And then we say, well, listen, I mean, as long as you're not infringing on me, you do whatever you want to do. As long as you don't bother me, it's okay. And it's funny how fast it goes from don't bother me to can I join too? So as we unpack this and really start to work through the book of Judges, I want us to look at that and think about how, 350 years seems like a long time, but it's not. We're talking just several generations. There's a great study, and I don't even think you can get it anymore, called The Three Chairs. It was a Lifeway study, and I can't remember the guy who wrote it, but he talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he talks about three chairs and how in 3 generations you can fundamentally change a family, a community, a nation, and a world. And so he talks about Abraham being the first chair. Abraham had a deep, personal, intimate relationship with God. He walked with God, he talked with God, he followed God, he listened to God's commands. They were important to him and he followed them. Isaac grows up in that household, knows the things to say and he knows the things to do, but he doesn't have the deep, intimate, personal relationship with God that his father had. He had a relationship, but it wasn't the same. And so we get a little bit of distance. Then we get Jacob, who grows up in Isaac's household, and Isaac has this kind of, okay, this is what we do, and we're a people of faith, and this is what you believe, and Jacob's like, why? And because. And Jacob grows up with no connection to God, no understanding of why we do what we do and why all this stuff matters. And you see how it works out in their life. And the whole Bible study talked about, you can see this in families. In families, you'll have generally the grandparents who have a deep, intimate, personal relationship with Jesus, and church is important, and they make their life around church and following God and doing those kind of things. And then they have kids who are raised in their home that we go to church because it's Sunday. And listen, that's a great habit to have, but kids need to come to church because they know why they're coming to church. It's not because we go on Sundays, because we want you to know Jesus. We want you to worship Jesus. But those kids grow up in that home and they become parents and they go to church on Sunday and nothing else. There's no devotions, there's no prayer, there's no talking about Jesus. We just go. And then those parents raise kids who have no connection to the church whatsoever. They go until they can go away. They go as long as their parents make them go, and then they go away and they say, well, I don't need God. Because the parents have told them, we go to church when it's important. We go to Easter, we go to Christmas, we may go a few other times. But listen, if we want to go to the lake, if we want to go to ball games, if we want to go do that, we do all that because that's what's important. And so these kids grow up and we say, well, why are they leaving the church? It's terrible. Well, we've never taught them to be a part of God's family. And that's what's happening in this nation. Generation after generation after generation. In fact, one of the phrases we hear in there, it says, this generation did not know God. It's almost like when you read in Exodus where it says that there arose a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. Well, here's a question. If this people, if these individuals, if these families were following God and his commands, how did a generation grow up and not know him? Did it get stolen by the culture? Did TV do it? Well, TV didn't do it because they didn't have TV. But what's the question? What's the answer? The answer is the people who knew didn't pass it on. Because we assume somebody else is going to do it. Somebody else can take care of it. Somebody else can tell them, I'm not qualified. I don't understand. Joel.
One of the degrees I studied for the assignment was to write a great theological statement. And so I did. Everyone I know convinced God that lets them live the way they want to and then worship him and think he's smiling.
Yeah. And that's what we see in Judges. I don't know if you heard Joel say that, but he said in one of the classes that he was, for one of his degrees, they said, write a great theological statement. And the statement he wrote was, everybody invents a God that lets you live how you want to live and smiles at the way that you live. And that's what we see in Judges. So one of the things that I really want to challenge us in is this, and I want to be very careful how I say this, because hearing what I just said, people can fall into legalism and think, well, we got to be at church all the time or the pastor's not going to be happy. It's not about perfect attendance. It's really not about that. It's about, do you have a relationship with Jesus and are you passing it on? So I don't want you to hear any of this as legalism because that's the exact opposite thing, but I want us to be responsible and do what these people didn't do, to stop and look at what we're doing in our lives and what we're passing on and what we're saying. We tell people what's important in our life by our time, by our money, and by our habits. We tell them what's important. And the people that see that and see what's most important in life is our kids and our family. So as we look at this and we ask the question, how does it happen? It happens when those of us who are called by God's name start to live in our own way, start to do our own thing, and continue to tell ourselves, we're totally okay. God's totally fine with this. This is a digression, and I'm sorry, but it's funny, and this is the struggle that I've had in my life, and maybe you've had in yours. It's so funny that I struggle with God's grace in my life except when it comes to my sin. And here's what I mean by that. I struggle that God loves me. I struggle that God cares about me. I struggle that, that God is happy with me and he's, satisfied that he called, all those kind of things. But you know what's funny when I don't struggle with God's grace? When I want to keep doing what I want to do. Because I'll start saying things like this. God's too kind to get angry. He's too compassionate to turn me away. And so I can just keep going and he's going to be totally fine with it. Isn't that ridiculous? I reject God's grace where I need it the most to transform me, and I embrace a bad understanding of God's grace to let me continue doing what I'm doing. Now, maybe you guys don't struggle in that way, but I do. They did. We reject the goodness of God that draws us to repentance, that calls us into relationship. No, you can't love me. I'm unworthy. I'm not any good. And then we embrace this bad understanding to say, oh no, I can keep going. God's not mad at me. I'm totally fine. So what exactly is a judge? Everybody's like, yay, we've moved off all the bummer stuff. Awesome. What exactly is a judge? Well, a judge was a special category, kind of along with the priesthood. He or she wasn't a priest, but they kind of acted in a sense as a decision maker. What we find is that judge is derived from the Hebrew word shofet. And that word has a wide range of meaning. It means someone who makes civil decisions, a governor, or a military leader. Many of them had spiritual authority. We find them being talked about in Deuteronomy 17, verse 9, where it says, go to the priest, go to the judge, and they'll decide matters between you. So what we have is this place or this position of judge where people come to settle disputes and to settle questions and to lead people and to govern people, sometimes even be the spiritual authority or spiritual example to people. And in the book of Judges, we're going to talk about, we just skipped over some stuff. We're going to talk about 12 judges. There are 12 judges found in the book of Judges. 6 are major, 6 are minor. Now, what I mean by that, when we say major and minor just means we have lots of information about them. Minor means that we don't. There's one guy, his name is Shamgar. We have one verse about him. That's it. Shamgar was a judge. Okay, all right, thanks. So we have major and minor, but here's the thing. We see that God calls them for a specific time and a specific purpose. And that cycle of stuff that we've been talking about, when the people call out for help, God sends the judge. And so they would go, and they were God's means of deliverance. And here's the crazy thing that you're going to have to deal with, that I have to deal with when we read this book. That God uses some really messed up people. It doesn't seem like every judge that God calls answers the call. Oh, they want to be a judge. They still want to be God's judge. I mean, Samson is a great example of that. Samson did everything that God told him not to do. They don't seem to be faithful. They don't seem to be good. They don't seem to be doing what's in the best interest of the people. I mean, you look at, the case can be made with Samson when we get to him that he caused more problems for the people of Israel because he kept antagonizing the Philistines for them to come and attack him. I mean, he'd get bored. I'm going to go kill some Philistines. It's Tuesday. I'm going to kill some Philistines. And he just kept doing this, and then the nation came and attacked him, and okay, now I'm going to fight and deliver. Just doesn't seem like that these people really would be the ones that God would choose, and so we're going to have to wrestle with that. What do we do with a judge who doesn't seem to heed God's call, to be good, to be faithful? They dealt with local and national problems. And here's an amazing thing. This wasn't something they passed down to their children. This wasn't like a kingly service where it's like, I'm king and now my family's going to be king until we have no family left. There's only one person that tried to do that, and that was Gideon. He tried to pass down his judge role to his son, and it went horribly wrong. We'll see that. But then you also see that even within the judges, called by God, used by God, that there's a downward spiral in them as well. And so we want to talk about the ethical questions that we're going to face. And I'm not going to answer these tonight. I'm going to put them out. We're going to talk about them a little bit. But we'll answer them as we go through this study. But the first one is this: why does God command or allow some of the things that we find in the book of Judges? Now, I'll be dealing with this a little bit on Sunday as we are doing our big questions, real answers thing, and talking about, is God a moral monster? And, is all the stuff that found in the Bible that God condones that? One of the things, and you'll hear me say this a couple of times, that just because something is recorded in the Bible doesn't mean God supports it. Just because it's reported, just because we have it, doesn't mean that God is in full support of it. Where this idea came from, I don't know, but it's silly because then we'd have to expunge all of our history books of anything that happened in history. Because if you write about the Holocaust, that means you support it. And in any other situation, we would be like, no, that's ridiculous. That's not right. So we need to understand that God records things that he doesn't support or condone, but then also God brings things to pass because he's God. This is a simple answer, and we'll kind of dive into this a little bit more, but we're going to see things in here that challenge us and challenge our concept of God, and we have to say, okay, what do we know to be true? God is God. God is good. God does what is right all the time. And so if there's something that in our feelings that we say is wrong, what are we going to believe? Are we going to believe our feelings? Are we going to believe the truth about who God is and what he does? Why are the judges allowed to get away with all this stuff? Now, I wanted to put the word seemingly in there. Seemingly allowed to get away with this stuff, because what you see is the judges have to answer for all the stuff that they do. They pay the consequences of that. But it does feel like sometimes that bad people, evil people, have all the fun. They get to do whatever they want. They get to live how they want, and it doesn't seem like that they have to pay. And it's because we have a very short-sighted view of things. We look at this 70, 80, if you're super lucky, 100 years that we have on earth, and we say that's not fair, and we forget that there's a place called eternity where people are going to go into, and they're going to deal with the consequences of their life for eternity. I don't know that even if you got 115 years of luxury here, would that do anything for you in eternity? So we are going to grapple with this. We are going to wrestle with this, that really they seemingly get away. They seemingly do what they want, but that's not really the case. And we've already talked about this a little bit, but I want you to think about it as we go through this book. What parallels do we find in the book of Judges and in our lives? What parallels do we find? Now, I'll be honest and say that that's probably not something that we want to do. We don't want to hold the mirror of the book of Judges up to our life to see if we fit any of those things, do we? But here's the good thing. Here's the thing that I think, and that's why Ruth comes after to show God's grace and mercy and forgiveness. The thing that you always need to remember is, yes, you hold the mirror up to get an accurate representation of who you are, knowing that Jesus is ready to heal and to forgive and to restore and to redeem. But you can't get any of those things until you see who you really are and how much you desperately need it. Any questions? I know that's a lot of information on a Wednesday night, and I'm sorry, but I wanted to throw all this at you so we can jump in next week and dive into the book of Judges, and I'm sure our crowd will be much smaller next week when they're like, I am not coming to listen to that. Thank you very much. I don't want to be bummed out on a Wednesday night. Sorry. I promise that it won't be I'll try not to bum you out. I'll try to end with hope and encouragement all the time. Any questions, any comments before we go? Nope? All right. Father, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for this time that we've had together. And I pray that you would just use this to really challenge us to see ourselves for who we really are, to see you and how you operate and work in this world, and to trust you, to surrender to you. And God, to begin to live the way you have called us to live, to pass these things down, to make them real in our life, to be different, to stand out, to not be settled and not be safe in the culture around us. And so, Father, I just pray that you'd be with us tonight. Give us your blessings and wrap your loving arms around us and shower us with grace and mercy and peace to get the rest that we need tonight to go out and live for you. In Jesus' name, amen.